evening to everybody here, and thank you so much for being here tonight. So now I'm going to present you a little overview of what was my capstone project, in which I focus on how to improve human welfare in the Peruvian Mahi Mahi fishery. So before diving into the project, I do want to state some facts. The first one is that I'm a biologist, so of course I didn't come to CSP with a strong fisheries nor a social science background. So you can imagine that throughout these past 2 years, I learned quite a lot. The second one is that fisheries are critically important in the world for food and economic security for Peru, as this whole country that I call my home shares around 7% of global captures for marine resources, and fisheries such as anchoveta, himahi, or giant squid are very important in Peru's export economy. The third one is that fisheries are facing a lot of issues right now, from stock depletion to marine pollution. But some issues or some problems are not as visible or noticed as others. Problems affecting the people behind the fisheries are far less noticed nor addressed. However, we have a growing awareness of widespread abuses in fisheries, including slavery, killings, and other human rights violations. So if sustainable fisheries are our goal here, we need to develop strategies to identify these risks and address human welfare in fisheries, at the same time as we address environmental sustainability. In my project, we found opportunity to do this through market-based solutions, using the particular case of fishery improvement projects, or FIPs. FIPs are multi-stakeholder strategies that aim to improve the environmental sustainability of a fishery by working within 3 principles: sustainable fish stocks, minimizing environmental impact, and having effective management of a fishery. Not only this, but FIPs are also a stepping stone for a fishery to get access to a certification such as the Marine Stewardship Council. And having this certification can become a really strong incentive for some fisheries. Traditionally, FIPs have only considered these 3 principles, prioritizing environmental sustainability. And just now they're starting to include and work on human rights and social responsibility. My capstone research is actually one of the very first pilots that integrate this missing component in an existing and learn from the process. To incorporate social responsibility, FIPs are adopting the Monterey framework, which includes and access to resources, ensuring equality and equitable opportunity to benefit, and improve food and livelihood securities. The Monterey framework was put into practice by FIPs using the Social Responsibility Assessment Tool, or SRA. And even though this tool was the development of this tool was originally led by Conservation International, this tool has been scaled to multiple organizations across the world. This is a tool that I use in my capstone project, piloting it to identify and assess social risk within the Mahi Mahi fishery. My initial work focused on describing different levels of social risk present in the Mahi Mahi fishery, targeting 3 communities already involved in the FIP process. I did this by doing a revision of existing regulations and treaties to understand how human rights were covered under existing policies in Peru. Then I followed this work with interviews with key informants to understand how this fishery actually operates and how the different stakeholders interact with each other, and also what risks or challenges they have to face in their everyday lives. The interview phase was originally meant to be done in person, but considering the challenging conditions of the pandemic in Peru and the travel restrictions, I had to have some adaptations to this. So I did interviews via Zoom calls, phone calls, and WhatsApp. The findings of the assessment were share with my practitioner partners and other collaborators of the FIP, such as WWF, Future of Fish, and Conservation International, to co-develop a work plan for social action in this fishery and improve the protocol of the SRA. Now, having all of this clear, I can now introduce you our study case, the Peruvian Mahi Mahi artisanal fishery. This fishery, the fishery improvement project for the Peruvian Mahi Mahi started in 2013, coordinated by WWF. This artisanal fishery operates seasonally during the austral spring and summer as warm waters get closer to the coastline. Each artisanal fishing vessel is actually very small, measuring up to 13 meters long and accommodating around 8 people at a time, including crew workers and the captain, who can in some cases also be the boat owner. This fishery is widespread along the coast of Peru, so it's possible to find some regional differences in the practices. For example, in some communities in the north, this fishery has become highly specialized, especially because of the length of the fishing trips. This can last up to 28 days at sea and go beyond 200 nautical miles from the coast, while in the south, fishing trips tend to be much shorter and stay closer to the coastline. Despite the small size of the fishing vessels and that most of the work in this fishery is done manually, this fishery is both highly productive and highly profitable. For example, in 2014, around 50% of the global landings of were actually from Peru market. Extra better price for the resource, but it also creates different standards in terms of environmental sustainability that this fishery has been working to achieve. One of the first lessons that I learned by starting to work in this fishery was to not underestimate it for being artisanal, even if when you hear artisanal, it sounds something smaller or simple. As this fishery involves multiple stakeholders in each layer of the supply chain. So it's quite easy to get lost. To help me with assessment and to direct future actions in this fishery, I developed this map of the supply chain, including all the different stakeholders on the supply chain, but also kind of picturing their influence in the system. As you can see, this is quite complex, but based on their influence over other stakeholders, some of the key highlights that I identified were the processing plants and some of the boat owners. As I follow with the assessment of the 3 principles for social responsibility, the findings were worrisome and showed how much work we still need to do in this sector. As you can see, most of the indicators were scored as either high social risk or near medium risk. Overall, the findings from both the document review and the interviews showed clear policy gaps for the protection of human and labor rights in fisheries, as well as highlighting some important information gaps and specific social vulnerabilities in the sector. Sadly, because of the travel restrictions and that this work was done remotely, I was only able to properly assess the first 2 principles. My findings are still plenty in this presentation. I will focus on these 2 principles. Starting with protecting human rights, dignity, and access to resources, I found clear policy gaps in terms of labor rights in fisheries. Right now, artisanal fishers kind of slip between the general labor law in one hand, which defines the rights for employees as long as they have working contracts, and in the other hand, the general fishing law that regulates and set conditions for fishing operations, but not for working conditions in fisheries. In addition to this, I found that compliance rates to the existing safety requirements are actually quite low. So practices such as the use of life jackets on board or having proper insurance for crew members are not common because of multiple reasons such as lack of funding, lack of space, and others. So it was expected that there are not easy solutions for all the problems that we're finding, but we are starting to identify these issues and starting a discussion around them. And this is really important if we want to make a change. I also found important gaps in terms of who can benefit from the fishery and how. Right now, there are no policies in play that promote participatory management in fisheries. This basically depends exclusively on the will of the authorities in office. Not only this, but I found reports on both different opportunities to benefit from the fishery and discrimination to certain groups, such as women and migrants, either local migrants or international migrants. These groups are usually limited to certain roles or jobs in the supply chain that hold little power, while sometimes receiving lower wages for the same work done by locals or done by men. I was also able to find reports on other communities beyond the scope of this assessment, finding more examples of dangerous work conditions in the fishery, affecting vulnerable groups of people, like this example affecting international migrants. However, not everything was about the risk and the dangers. The idea was to also find opportunities and potential strategies that could be adopted and scaled by FIP coordinators to address or prevent social risk. And an interesting example of this was found in the southern communities. To give you some context on this strategy, you should know that the most common or frequent conflicts in this fishery happen between the processing plants and the fishing communities or organization, usually because of reductions in the price for the resource. I found that in some communities in the south, processing plants were actually implementing a minimum price cap to prevent the prices for the resource to go really low, and also preventing conflicts with the fishing organizations. I also learned that it was only possible, or this only happened because in the south, the processing plants care much more about keeping good relationships with fishing organizations. This could happen because there are fewer communities in the south, they're better organized, or that they are more away from each other, but whatever the reason of this, they adopted this strategy and it seems to be working. Something that was clear by the end of this project is that it's likely that most of the social risks found for the Mahi Mahi fishery are actually being shared by other artisanal fisheries in Peru. Maybe because by the government. This makes it really difficult for NGOs or other organizations to create systemic change. But finding this kind of initiatives adopted by stakeholders in the system are really a true source of hope. To wrap this up, throughout this project, I was not only able to identify the social risks in the fishery and pilot the SRA, but I also learned quite a lot from the process itself and from the different factors that can affect the level of social risk in the fishery. For example, I learned about the importance of considering the cultural background of the communities under evaluation, which is very important when working with a fishery migrant origin from the Southern Andes, where women tend to have a more active role in both businesses and in fishing. In the other hand, the communities in the north are much older and keep some traditions in which women dedicate themselves almost exclusively to their role as housewives or as mothers. And this reflects in terms of the SRA as requirement for fisheries in undergoing a FIP process. I hope that this kind of work and this approach can be scaled to other fisheries in Peru. For example, I see potential of scaling this kind of work to the Anchoeta fishery, which is a giant in Peru, and can give us a glance of what's going on in the industrial sector, but also scaling this kind of approach to other artisanal fisheries, such as the giant squids, which is also a very important artisanal fishery and is actually quite close to the Mahi Mahi fishery, as people working in both fisheries kind of jump between them for along the year. Finally, it's also important to acknowledge some of the challenges that we still need to face. For example, as I mentioned before, FIPs are often a stepping stone for a fishery to get access to certification. And if we're working to improve the work in terms of social action in FIPs, there are still questions of what's going to happen once the FIP the fishery gets access to a certification if the certifications of the MSC are not yet requiring for fisheries to actually show efforts of social action. However, I am still confident that our efforts and our work will pay off as we move towards more sustainable fisheries. I do want to thank my advisors, Don Kroll and Nathan Biner, for their support and their help in this project and for helping me cope with everything that happened in this past crazy year. But I also want to thank all the people and the organizations that helped me in this process. And I hope that I will keep learning and working with them in the near future. And I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you all so much for listening, and happy to answer any questions.